Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Chasing Creativity. This is Kiran Manral. Today I will be chatting with the very fabulous Seema Anand, who has taken Instagram by storm with her videos as a storyteller and sexual health educator and become a phenomenon all unto herself. Welcome to Chasing Creativity, Seema.
Thank you so much for having me, Kiran. It's such a delight to be with you.
My pleasure completely. Seema, tell me, I read about something in back when you were in college. You came across the Kama Sutra. Till then, you were only exposed to the classic English texts and, whatever's in our syllabus. And then the Kama Sutra was something you encountered. What changed from there?
Okay, so it wasn't quite in college. In college, like you said, we only ever studied the traditional. I did English honors at college, and I was in college from 1980 to 83. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that at that time, our syllabus only consisted of the Arnolds and the Tennysons and the Brownings and the Shakespeares of the world. I can recite Shakespeare backwards. I can tell you all about Homer. I can pretty much narrate the romantics, the metaphysical poets, etc. I knew nothing about Indian literature because we were never taught Indian literature. Mm-hmm. So I didn't even know about our text. The only text that we ever had to study was Premchand for our Hindi syllabus. Mm-hmm. And if you ever read Premchand, it's very well, they're not upbeat stories, put it that way. They're pretty they're sad, they're unhappy, they're full of misery. And nobody really ever explained what Premchand was all about. And I want to tell you this just because there are going to be younger people hopefully listening to this, and I want them to know how incredible his literature is. We weren't taught it. I absolutely hated it. Okay. And I did. And it was only recently when I was attending a lecture and I was told that, there was this group of, what were they called? The Progressive Writers Society that started in India in the very early in the 1900s.
1900s. Okay.
So people like Ismat Chugtai, etc. were all part of that. Premchand was not part of the Progressive Writers movement. He was before that. Mm-hmm. But he was the one who addressed the first conference of the Progressive Writers movement. And he said to people, you know what? The politics of our country have changed. We need to change our vocabulary and our stories. Till then, this is what I focus on. My work around the Kama Sutra is about Shringhar. It's about the metaphors, the vocabulary, the poetry of Shringhar, of beauty, etc. That from 2000 years ago, Kiran had developed gradually into this exquisite poetry that we know, but very focused on the aesthetics. Mm-hmm. Okay. And as it had developed, as it evolved, it went from the ordinary woman being, the woman with her hair flying away and all that. It came from that kind of beauty to this very set idea of beauty that we all grew up with, that, if your hair was perfectly in place, if your makeup was, if you were silent, suddenly that became the idea of beauty. And from there, what happened was that gradually people started to say, if you are this beautiful, you are like a goddess, you are worthy of my respect. If you're an ordinary woman, you came in for nothing. Mm-hmm. And Premchand was the one who said, life has changed, politics have changed, social norms are changing. We need to change our vocabulary of beauty to include every single woman into it. Now, quite honestly, if somebody had taught me that at the start of reading Premchand, I would have read it so differently. If somebody had said that here was a man so progressive that he was actually talking about, because that's the only way, you and I know, we're both creative people, the only way to change something on the ground is when you change a story.
Absolutely. The story
changes everything. The words that you're using and the story that you're telling, that's the only time that change happens. Laws come in and laws go out. For the average person, they're not worth the paper they're written on, unfortunately, because people don't know what those laws mean. Society doesn't give a damn. It's the only way of creating change is through a story. And we were never taught that this was how important Premchand was. So today I will go back to reading Premchand. But yeah, at that point, it was very painful. When I came to live in the UK, I actually started to study Indian texts. our
Okay.
ancient stories,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And from there, I actually went into looking at the Kama Sutra, because as I study the stories, my focus has always been women's narratives.
Mm-hmm.
How the stories that we tell impact our identities as women. So if you tell stories, society tells stories about how a man comes home from work, he's drunk, he beats up his wife, but she's such a good woman. She's so good. She never ever raises her voice again. She never tells the word outside. उसकी बेइज्जती नहीं बाहर जाके करती. उसकी इज्जत रख देती है. घर की इज्जत उसने रख ली. चुप रही. कितनी देवी समान है. You then have created an identity for the good woman. You've taken away all parameters for a woman to stand up for her rights, to stand up for her own protection, because she then becomes the bad woman, the one who speaks up outside. And to me, that is what fascinates me about stories. So that's what I was working on. I then started working on Indian texts, looking on how the Indian stories that we told defined women's identities. That's when I realized that we never tell stories of a woman's right to her own body.
Okay.
Her body is
Okay.
always somebody else's property.
Mm-hmm.
Her pleasure is always somebody else's permission. Like somebody has to permit her to feel that way. And that's when I started to look at what are the stories that we had shut down, because we are the land that wrote the Kama Sutra after all. And yes, you're absolutely right. When I first read the Kama Sutra, I read it pretty much like everybody else would. You know, we sort of half understanding, this is a book about 23 years now, I think it's been. 23 years later, I realized in the beginning, when I used to read the Kama Sutra or any text, I would read one paragraph and think, I know this now. Today, when I read something, I realize how little I know. So the more I read, the less I know that I know.
Oh, that's immense. That's an immense learning. And I think it took the years for that to come about, that the more you read, the less you know. Tell me, Seema, being an older person in what is considered a younger person's space, being silverhead on Instagram, and to be talking about sex and sexuality and agency and consent and all these things, what have been the challenges for you?
Okay, so the first thing, as you can imagine, is the abuse that comes with being older. You're constantly being told everything from, blah, 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 buria. I won't go into the bad words, to saying, dono pair kabar mein hai, tu abhi kya kar rahi? And in very rude terminology, I have to say, nali mein gir ke mar ja, tere marne wala time aa gaya hai, etc. Right down to, I just did a podcast, a little reel with somebody who is HIV positive. And we were talking about this, and somebody actually wrote and said, oh, this old woman is already at the end of her life. We don't care if she gets HIV. Don't spread this message to other people. Let them learn, etc., etc. Meaning that, whatever we had put down was not going down well with them. So there is that section of people. I think they're just very threatened. That's why they react like that. What threatens them, I think, is just the fact that how dare a woman be talking about this. And like you said, I come to it, this year I will be 61. I come to it with a great deal of experience, with a great deal of having lived life, which somebody in their 20s hasn't. No matter how much you think you know, you don't. And I think for them to feel that you have reached that age, that you have the nerve to talk about this, and the fact that you have the experiences, the wisdom to talk about something. It's the trifecta. It's like, the Trimurti of, oh my God, hell is going to take over now, it's just horrible for them. And I understand that these people are going to have to come to grips with society as it changes, but they're going to go down fighting, as you can see. I mean, they will, there's a lot of violence and anger and just a lot of toxicity around accepting the fact that a woman can have her own agency, she can have autonomy on her body. But that is one thing. Then I also get a lot of people saying, ये तुम्हारे प्रार्थना करने का टाइम आ गया, ये पूजा पाठ करने का टाइम आ गया. And I'm like, thankfully, हमने बचपन में पूजा पाठ कर ली थी. So now I can also do other things, Maybe if there's only one time in your life that you have to do it, so then it's okay.
I've done my bit.
Yeah, I've done my bit. Thank you. But on the other side is also the confidence that it generates in a lot of the younger women.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
To think that there is somebody who can talk about it. It's like when you look for an older person to give you some advice because they've been through it rather than somebody who's kind of saying, okay, we're going to do this anyway. My first point when I started this, Kiran, was to actually create a space where parents and kids could talk.
Okay.
A lot of young girls, even till today, are going through absolute shit in their intimate lives, whether it's with marriages or boyfriends or whatever, and they cannot talk to their mothers about it. And unfortunately, they're being treated that badly because the guys know that there's nobody they can go and talk to.
Okay.
And I wanted this to be a platform where mums and daughters could start talking about it initially. That's why the language, my vocabulary has been so careful. That I use words that nobody will feel awkward using.
Okay.
So that's been my role. People forget that we were also young at one time, right?
Absolutely.
We were 20 at one stage and we did all of these things and we went through some of this stuff. And the only difference is that it's all on social media now, so everybody else can see what's going on. But at every stage, we had things that were going on. I think people forget. I think they think I was born this old.
I think that's the tragedy of getting older. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy for everyone. We'll all get there sometime or the other. Let's take a short break and be right back with Seema Anand. Welcome back, Seema. I know that the pandemic sort of completely changed the way you positioned yourself. And I've been watching your journey and I've been admiring how you grow. And you've been like a case study I've been telling everybody about. How difficult was it to get onto Instagram, which is a medium that we're not very familiar with? Hell, I don't know how to use Instagram still, but you totally owned it. I mean, you took it over and owned it. So how did you go about reinventing yourself?
So it was actually by pure chance. I had, just before the pandemic, there were a lot of problems with, and things weren't really going very far. And there was a very difficult and unpleasant ending of that relationship. And I was kind of sitting at home, everything that till then, I used to do all my live talks. I'd never felt the need to go onto social media because whatever we were doing was actually happening. Whatever I was wanting to do was happening anyway. So I wasn't having to do this grind that is social media. When we went into lockdown and when everything else shut down and when I parted company with my agents, my youngest one, my daughter, finished university, her third term, finished during the pandemic. So she was at home, we weren't doing anything. And she said to me, the same child, I might add, who a few years ago I'd said to her, I think I should go on Instagram. She said, really, Mom? No, people of your age don't do Instagram. Okay. So the same child said, Mom, I think we should get you on social media. And so I have to give her credit for this, that she was immensely patient. We had the hugest fights because when I am invited to go and talk somewhere, and before that, the only social media channel I had was YouTube.
Okay.
Now, YouTube is where you make long videos, right? You talk about things at length. Also, my subject is such, Kiran, that if I'm going to change a stereotype, the 30-second thing is not what you need. You know what I mean? Like you have to explain what you're trying to talk about. My daughter would be constantly like, no, you cannot explain. You cannot go to a minute. You have to do this in 30 seconds because back then the Instagram reel was 30 seconds. So we had the biggest fights because I was like, no, people want to know more about it. They want to hear more and in-depth stuff. And she'd be like, trust me, they don't. And so this particular fight would take place every day. She's incredible. She would sit down with me and sometimes it could take us an hour to just keep repeating the same thing before we got it right and how she thought it should be. And that's how we actually started. So she was editing, she was putting it up for me, etc. And then what happened was, God was kind. I think this was very early in the pandemic. So people were hungry for content. There was a need for it. So maybe we kind of caught it at the crest. I don't know. It was also, I have noticed, I don't know if you did any research on this, but every time there has been a pandemic over the centuries, every time, the thing that has come out of it most is erotic literature.
Really? That's very interesting.
It's been one of the side effects of pandemics through the centuries across the world. And even this time, there was a lot of erotica that came out. I don't know, there's some kind of level of, we go through stages. There's that initial, this thing of, oh my God, I can't go out. Then is that thing of, enjoying your own company. Then you get to that point of getting fed up with it. Then you want to explore something else. So erotica has a very large part of the side effects, let's call it, of a pandemic. Anyway, I guess maybe there was that wave that was coming, and it just happened to be during that time. I have to also say that, as you know, as most people who use social media know, it's a very toxic world.
It is.
And a few months down the line, she actually said to me, she said, I can't deal with this anymore, because I didn't know anything about social media. My daughter was dealing with every aspect of it, from filming me when I created the content, to editing it, to putting it up, to reading the comments so that the abusive ones, and there was a lot of very, very awful stuff in the beginning. And she said, I can't, I'm just getting too triggered by this. I can't deal with it. So I had to, at that point, go out, look for a team, start building up another sort of infrastructure around me. But basically, yes, that's how we started. And the difference, you were asking, what is the difference between them? I'll tell you what. Before this, every time I was invited somewhere, somebody would fly me down, put me up in complete luxury, pay me lots of money, and sit there to listen, because they had paid all that money for me to come to them, and they really wanted to listen. On Instagram, you put your stuff up for free. You get trolled for it. You have to deal with all the people who are coming in and abusing you. And that's the difference. So basically, it's the most thankless thing in the world. But yeah, it's they're out there to kill your creativity as much as possible.
Oh, those are harsh words, kill your creativity. But you've become a phenomenon, Seema.
Thank you.
It's really, really, really wonderful seeing how much you do and how much you put out there. I'm getting into the deep dive questions on creativity now. So I read something on your website which said you can do anything. All you need is a story. And that's something someone told you. And that's how you decided to rewrite your story, and how you decided to. I think those words had a very powerful impact on you. Can you tell me the moment and how storytelling first came to you?
So I think that it must have always been there on the inside. There are some things that you resonate with. But basically, I had a horrible tragedy when I was very young. And I was in college at that point. And I remember kind of sitting there in a heap thinking, how does one get past this? And a friend of mine at that point said to me, she said, the only way to get past something like this is that you break your life up into little tiny stories. So don't look at your life as one big picture. Make everything a small story, because every time there's a small story, you can change the ending one story at a time. And I thought that was incredible advice. I don't know whether I clung on to it because of what I was going through. I was just so unhappy at that point. But I was ready to cling on to anything. But it really resonated with me, Kiran. And this is my philosophy till date. We all know that the world changes, time changes, things change. Nothing is static. So if you're having good times, you're going to have bad times. If you have a bad time, it's a cycle. It will come back to good times. And I have realized that if I pray for great things to happen a lot, like, okay, why can't this, God, why can't you give me more success in this cycle? Like, if I'm over here, why can't I just go to the next thing? Then I'm extending my cycle of the up, of the good stuff. Then the cycle of the bad stuff will automatically become bigger. It's just that cycle, isn't it? I don't know. It may sound really stupid, but it's just the philosophy I live by. And so I always feel that I take my good times in small cycles. Like, I'll have something really good, then something bad happens. And I feel like I'm creating and I can change that ending, one little ending at a time, because things do go wrong. I believe that we are not made up of molecules. We're made up of stories.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely.
Human beings are a collection of stories. That's what we live by. And, our brains are like a stack of stories. They're preconceived notions that we exist with. And if you want any kind of new learning to penetrate that, you have to move that entire stack, because everything is there in your brain and you pretty much made up your mind. It's very difficult to change your mind. I have found that the only way that I can change the way I think about something is by tapping into an existing story.
Okay, that's lovely.
And looking at that story from a slightly different angle.
Actually, that brings me right to my next question, the one that I was going to ask you. Why do human beings need stories? We've always been telling stories, from the fireplace and caves when prehistoric man was telling stories. He was talking about the hunt. Mythology has it. Everything has it. We're full of stories. But why is this intrinsic need for stories so deeply ingrained in human beings?
I think they give meaning to our facts. You have a factual thing. It's like a piece of rock. You pick up a stone. It's a stone. You remember how you picked it up, where you found it, why you were attracted to that piece of stone. Suddenly that stone has an identity. I think stories give meaning to our facts. I think people don't ever understand, or it takes them a long time to understand, that when you put out a fact, it means different things to different people. There is no such thing as the absolute truth. There's nothing Kantian about our society. There's no absolute truths. So everything shifts according to our perspective, and you view everything from your experience or your knowledge or the stories that you carry inside you. And I think that's why I always tell this story about how, when people say, like, when storytelling started to become really big in the corporate sector, it was very big in America. In the UK, people were still looking a little askance at you. They'd look at you as if to say, oh God, here she is, this hippie. Because I would also turn up in the UK corporate sector with my sari, with my bangles and so on. And they were looking at you thinking, okay, whatever. In India, it was completely shut off. Like, there was no way in hell you could go into a corporate sector with a story.
Okay.
It was all about the PowerPoint, the facts, you've got to show me scientifically. Science is all about the stories you tell yourself. I'm sorry, everything comes down to a story. I think over time, people have realized that the biggest learning comes when I tell you a story. A story has the problem, the process, and the solution all in one place. When I tell you that story, you will pick from it the bit that resonates with you. Yeah. So everybody takes their learning from it. It reaches a wider set of people. But they will take from it how they would deal with something. It gives them the option of thinking, okay, that could have been done. That means that if I was to do it slightly differently, like this, I could have done this too. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That whole thing of try again. It's that little connection with the story that it gives you meaning to your facts. Facts on their own don't have any, they're just dry words on a paper. They actually don't have any meaning. And I think that people who are, particularly leaders, okay, you look at any really effective leader through history, they have led through stories.
Absolutely, yes. Storytelling, I think there was a quote by someone, stories are data with soul.
Absolutely. So, everybody who's an intelligent leader will always know that it's the story that will be impactful. What are the stories that you're telling? Today, every corporate sector out there, there are organizations trying to create organizational stories. You want to have stories that belong to your organization. I always think, look at Tatas, no matter what they do or don't do, what an amazing story they carry. we have that narrative around the Tatas that they identify class. Automatically. It's an inbuilt story out there. It's going to take a lot to shift that. So, yeah, stories give us meaning.
Lovely. Stories give us meaning, and create your own story and change your ending. I think these are great learnings that people should take away. You've done a lot of research on the ancient texts, and there are a lot of stories you have come across. Anything that astounded you when you began your reading as to, they were thinking like this back then, and why aren't we thinking like this now?
So let's just take the Kama Sutra on its own, for instance. Forget everything else. I mean, when I read that text, I think, wow, let's take the most basic thing. The fact that they talk about, most people don't know this, by the way, that most people still think it's a book on positions, which, okay, it's not. Most people don't know that the Kama Sutra doesn't actually talk about the act of sex. It talks about pleasure. It talks about pleasure, and it talks about the importance of the woman's pleasure. And it emphasizes over and over again, in a text 2000 years ago that was written only for men. The Kama Sutra was written to teach young men how to live their perfect life. It was teaching them how to build their house, how to decorate their house, how many beds to have in a bedroom, how many bedrooms to have, how many hours they should spend talking to their minor birds and their totas. It's got literally how a man should get married, etc., etc., etc. In the midst of that, there's this little oasis, section 2, which is on the arts of pleasure, which is suddenly talking about the pleasure of women and the importance of the pleasure of women. It's talking about the importance of consent. It's talking about the importance of not using force, of violence, even in passion, even passionate force, like it talks to them about, it says that such and such king, in a moment of heated passion, he lashes out at his mistress and he kills her, and such king gets so excited that he strikes out in a moment of complete passion and he blinds his mistress. And it keeps saying, don't do it, don't do it. Here is a text that was talking about the importance of understanding how a woman will receive pleasure during oral sex. It's talking about the importance of different types of kisses. It's talking about how love bites. You should not start your foreplay with love bites, that you should actually, that's something that has to come much, much later. Only donkeys begin with love bites, because a lot of people out there are donkeys, sorry. It also says, Kiran, and you're going to love this one, there is a chapter on the stories that you should tell before and after making love. So it talks about what kind of conversation you should have before you even start your foreplay, and it says that, you should start with telling either funny or naughty or gossipy stories. And the idea behind that is that you transition from what your brain has been like during the day. You've come back home, you've got the stress of work, things have not gone right, you had an argument with somebody, your head is full of that. You suddenly you're supposed to get into foreplay, you start kissing each other, you jump into bed. How do you suddenly switch your brain off? You don't. And how do you expect to have really good lovemaking if your brain is still occupied with something else? Because people don't seem to understand that. They think that sex is all about your genitalia. You have your sexual organs. That's the stuff that gets hammered one into the other, and that's sex. And it's not. Even your sexual organs are very intelligent organs. They know what's going on in the rest of the body. You're stressed up there, you're not going to have arousal down there. It's that straightforward. So this was about transitioning.
Okay, that's lovely.
You change what is in your head, you clear it. It's like having a sorbet before you start your amuse-bouche, before you clear your palate. Isn't that amazing that they understood that had to be done so that you bring yourself mentally into the right space? It talks about treating lovemaking as a thing of such beauty that you would get dressed for this. You do your sola shringar for it. As opposed to today, where you kind of wash off your makeup, you get into an old nightie, you turn the light off, and then you jump into bed. It's like, I'm sorry, are you really thinking of it in the same way? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just incredible with the knowledge and the wisdom that it brings to you. And yeah, they were thinking about this 2000 years ago, and we've lost it because we have grown up in a twilight zone where we've been taught that sex and pleasure, particularly, not sex, pleasure is a sin. You have to have sex to have children, but you can't feel pleasure because that's bad.
I think most of us would like to believe that, our parents, at least, that our kids were immaculate conception.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that continues generation on generation. I'm coming into the questions on your creativity, Seema. How do you plan your schedule for your reels? How do you ideate? Do you have like an Excel sheet? Do you decide this is what I'm going to do? And what do you do when you run out of ideas or you feel like a creative block?
Okay, so for the longest time, I felt very guilty about this because I don't have a plan.
Okay, that's wonderful.
I know, I'm not sure that it is because my team get very frustrated with me, and they've said to me for ages that, Seema, if we could just plan this the week ahead, it'd be so much easier because they have their lives as well. They do have a life aside from me. Unfortunately, I don't. I get very excited, Kiran. My biggest excitement is when I find a new story.
Okay.
And I want to suddenly explore that. So, I will go down that path. Or if I get a question, and I get thousands of questions, but something that really makes me want to respond there and then. You know what I mean? So it's pretty much what comes to us.
Mm-hmm.
Being a storyteller, I find that I have now had to more or less give up the idea of storytelling on my social media page because there's just so much of the sexual health stuff that comes up, which is really necessary. And so I have given myself a little bit of leeway and said, one day in the week, I'm just going to do stories, silly stories that are just for the fun of it, stories because for the sake of stories. So this recent months, I had something called the Winter Wednesday Weirdness. I know that winter in India is over. Over here, we still have partially winter, but we're going to stick to Wednesday Weirdness because I just decide to find unusual and weird and strange stories and give myself the privilege of doing a story once in a while. But let's say I talk about masturbation. And I will say, well, masturbation is not a sin. If you wish to do it, you may. If you don't want to, don't do it. Now, we've all said it over and over again. I find that people don't want to have that, like a fact, like, okay, what does it mean to me and my personal story? People will hear that, but they want to ask their own question around masturbation, which might be identical to 20 other people who are writing in, but in their mind, it's their specific thing.
Question. Yeah.
I've also realized that one of the things that people really, really want to hear from me is a response to their real-time problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we trying to assuage people's worries about their body, about the myths that they're being told about pleasure, about the messages people send in which are specific to their problems, and about occasionally me wanting to put out a story. At the moment, we're not running out of ideas.
And may you never run.
So we're okay for the time being. And yeah, maybe never. But yeah, if I had my way, I'd do a lot more stories, I have to say, because I just think, is there anything more fabulous than a story?
Tell me about the 3,000 step stories that you do. What's that all about?
Okay. So the 3,000 Step Stories was a very interesting project that I started during the pandemic. Somebody got in touch with me. They're called Active Essex and ECDP. ECDP stands for the Essex Cultural Diversity Project.
Okay.
They got in touch with the Active Essex, and the idea was to try and get older people particularly moving during the pandemic. Active Essex was just trying to get people exercising and moving. ECDP said, how can we do this for particularly the elder people within the diaspora? So this is where it started from, because there were a few of the elder people who live alone around my house, and we were checking up on them constantly. And this one lady who went into very deep depression because she said that there was nothing for her to do. Like, she said, I can't watch TV. Everything is a rerun. There's nothing new. And the only thing that she was listening to was a katha.
Okay.
So her whole thing was that she was listening to prayers. And after a while, her mind wasn't getting out, like it was on in the background, but you're walking around that same little room on the inside, you have nothing new to think about. What do you do? So the idea of the 3000 step stories was that it would give them something that was interesting, something that they could giggle about. So the idea was that these stories were not going to be straightforward, goody goody stories, but slightly weird, slightly different. A lot of them, as you may have heard, were they were part of a series that ABP News had done called Gangster Ki Girlfriend. Which I'll tell you about in a minute. But basically, I teamed up with this wonderful musician, Merlin D'Souza, who's she has a studio in Mumbai. And she said to me, don't worry, I'll put the music in so that if people are exercising, they walk to the story, and the music at the background gives them a beat to walk to. So that was the background of the story. They were supposed to be approximately half an hour, which is approximately 3000 steps. And it was just to get people keeping fit. And very kindly, Yasser Usman, who was at that point, his wife, the lovely Nazia Iram. So Yasser said to me, he said, ABP did this series that he had researched for called Gangster Ki Girlfriend. And it was on various gangsters and their love interest. And he said that they put it up on their news, but they'd used a lot of clips from different films. And so they were in breach of copyright. They had to take it down. So he said to me, ye mere kaam ki ab nahi hai, tum ye le lo, inko tum adjust kar lo jaise karna, and tell them as stories, because I wasn't monetizing them in any way. So he gave me the stories. I then translated them into English. The biggest challenge that I faced, one was that I wanted to, obviously, when you translate something from Hindi to English, and you are going to have to change the tone a little bit. The other was that I wasn't really just focusing on the girlfriend part of it. I wanted a few other things, so there was a bit more research. Most importantly, I wanted to change their endings, Kiran, because these stories came very much with the fact that there is this woman, okay, she falls in love with so-and-so who's a gangster, and then in the end, this is what happens to her. Stupid, like, the woman finishes badly. It was that kind of story. And I had to work out some way of redoing the story so that the woman doesn't come across as the victim in the end. I just didn't want that constantly. So, then there came a point where social media just took off, and I haven't had a chance to do all of them. The next one that I was writing, was translating, with Dawood Ibrahim and Mandakini. So, wo wali abhi batane wali hai. But I've had a lot of people writing and saying, please, can you redo it? I even had one very sweet girl write to me and say, I'm putting on weight because ever since you stopped doing these, I don't go for my walks anymore. So can you do the stories?
So you have to take it up. I hope Gangster Ki Girlfriend continues. I'm going to do a last question now with you, Seema. With all the work that you do, online and offline, what would you like your legacy to be?
If I can get people to understand that a woman's pleasure is not something to fight against, that a woman's pleasure is not a scary thing, that women have the right to their pleasure. I think that will, just the fact that they have the right to their consent, they have the right to pleasure, will change the way that we look at women as human beings. It will alter the course of a lot of sexual violence. I just want people to be able to accept that rather than, till today, when I talk about sexual pleasure, I get threats. Ugly, ugly threats. Death threats, rape threats. Just for talking about it. I just would like to see that change.
So, from your lips to God's ears, I hope that comes true and attitudes do change. And looking forward to more Gangster Ki Girlfriend stories coming up, and you have to be writing your next book.
And it's just as a little spoiler alert, we discovered an old story called Plague Ki Chudel.
Plague Ki Chudel.
Which was
nice.
It's a great Hindi story. So usme se we're taking some aspects of it and trying to see if we can translate bits of it. And there's another Malayali story that we've been given the rights to translate into Hindi and do. So, look out for some fun stories.
All the very best, Seema. Thank you for your time and for taking time out for this. And we'll catch you soon in India, hopefully.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.